On December 11, 2020, after business hours on a Friday, a single document was quietly uploaded to a federal database. It contained no press release, no executive quotes, no strategic explanation. Just one sentence, 27 words long, notifying regulators that Oracle Corporation was relocating its headquarters out of California. The filing attracted almost no attention. Markets did not react. Politicians did not respond. There was no public debate. Yet in that administrative silence, something fundamental shifted. This was not an announcement meant to be heard. It was a signal meant to be followed. This was the beginning. 4 years later, the consequences of that unnoticed filing are no longer abstract. They are visible in shuttered refineries, idle pipelines, hollowed-out downtowns, and a state budget swinging violently from surplus to deficit. Oracle's departure was framed as a symbolic tech industry footnote, a matter of remote work and executive preference. But it marked the moment when California's most successful corporations stopped arguing with the system and started exiting it. What followed was not a mass exodus overnight, but a delayed cascade. One company leaving did not collapse the state. Hundreds following the same logic began to. As energy infrastructure faltered and capital fled, a localized corporate decision revealed itself as the early tremor of a statewide structural failure that most people never connected back to that quiet Friday afternoon. Since that filing, 352 corporations have moved their headquarters out of California. These were not marginal firms or struggling startups, but companies with billions in annual revenue and workforces measured in the thousands. Together, they removed roughly $102 billion in income from the state's economy and more than 24,000 high-earning taxpayers from its tax base. California's budget, heavily dependent on a narrow band of high-income earners and corporate profits, absorbed the shock slowly at first, then all at once. A record surplus of $97. $5 billion reported in mid-2022 flipped into a projected deficit of $68 billion less than 2 years later. A $165 billion swing driven not by recession alone, but by departure. Each exit reduced revenue, each reduction increased fiscal pressure, and each increase made the environment less tolerable for those still remaining. The math compounded whether policymakers acknowledged it or not. The process that drove these exits followed a pattern precise enough to be replicated across industries. First came rising regulatory costs, justified individually and implemented incrementally. Companies responded by investing in compliance, environmental upgrades, legal staff, and reporting systems. Then came restrictions on expansion, delays in permitting, and mandates that altered operating economics. Revenue growth flattened while costs continued to rise. Profit margins narrowed, then disappeared. At that point, the decision was no longer ideological. It was arithmetic. Oracle executed the playbook with surgical precision. Minimal disclosure, maximum discretion, relocation without confrontation. Energy companies followed the same script, only with far heavier physical assets left behind. At the Los Angeles refinery operated by Phillips 66, Juan Alvarez spent 14 years as a process technician. He worked rotating shifts, managed complex chemical systems, and built a career around skills that existed almost nowhere else. His daughter enrolled in chemical engineering at UC Davis, planning to enter the same industry in the same state. When the refinery announced its closure days after new inventory storage legislation became law, Juan's severance package could not bridge the gap to her graduation. At 53, retraining meant leaving California or abandoning his field entirely. In Silicon Valley, former Oracle engineers faced similar choices years earlier, weighing uprooting families against remaining in a shrinking job market that no longer rewarded specialization. In both cases, the system did not fail them suddenly. It withdrew from them gradually, then completely. The collapse did not remain contained within individual sectors. Oracle's departure reduced demand for office space, accelerating vacancy rates that rose from under 5% in San Francisco before the pandemic to roughly 37% by 2024. Property values followed. Buildings that sold for tens or hundreds of millions of dollars lost the majority of their value in a matter of years. As refineries closed, pipelines lost throughput. When pipelines shut down, fuel costs rose. Higher energy costs raised operating expenses for logistics, manufacturing, agriculture, and defense installations. Military bases that once relied on nearby refineries were forced to source fuel from distant suppliers, increasing costs and vulnerability. Each failure weakened another system, not by coincidence but by design of interdependence. While California dismantled its capacity to produce and process energy, other regions positioned themselves to absorb the opportunities left behind. Gulf Coast refineries expanded. Texas and Louisiana prepared to process heavier crude grades as global supply chains shifted. Capital that might have modernized California's infrastructure instead rebuilt facilities elsewhere, under regulatory regimes that rewarded compliance rather than punishing it. The state that once led in environmental technology now imported fuel produced under lower standards from farther away, increasing global emissions while claiming local victories. Strategic advantages were surrendered quietly, without acknowledgement, as if absence itself could substitute for policy. The story from Oracle to oil follows a single unbroken logic. Regulatory pressure increases. Compliance costs exceed returns. Expansion becomes impossible. Companies stop fighting, file their paperwork, and leave. The tax base erodes. Infrastructure weakens. The remaining system becomes more expensive, more fragile, and less attractive, accelerating the next departure. It is not a mystery and it is not an accident. It is a cycle driven by arithmetic and reinforced by silence. The only question that remains is whether California can still reverse a process that has already consumed its corporate core and physical foundation, or whether the point at which departure becomes irreversible has already passed.